The Commodore 64 arrived in 1982 and went on to become the best-selling single model of home computer ever produced. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 12 and 17 million machines found their way into homes around the world. For many of us, it wasn't just a computer, it was our first real gaming system. The memories of watching the screen flicker while the game loaded, and entire afternoons disappearing, while a single game slowly loaded into memory. Over the years, the Commodore 64 built a library of thousands of titles, ranging from quick arcade diversions to ambitious adventures that pushed the machine far beyond what anyone expected from an 8-bit computer. I absolutely love covering them all on the channel, but I thought I'd have a stab at this. A list that looks back at 50 essential Commodore 64 games, the ones that helped define the machine in my opinion, the ones I still love decades later, and the ones that remain fascinating examples of creativity on limited hardware. And of course, no list like this is ever universally agreed upon. That's part of the fun. This list is built to cover everything. Arcade brutality, brain-melting puzzles, big simulations, oddball experiments, and the kind of games that we absolutely loved firing up on our Commodore 64. If you think I've missed an obvious one, don't be polite, tell me in the comments. So while watching, consider two options. Which Commodore 64 game would you place at number 1? And which game absolutely deserved a place here, but didn't make the cut? Let's begin. Uuno Turhapuro, Muuttaa Maalle. The first entry on the list is something of a curiosity outside Finland, but it represents an important moment in European Commodore 64 history. Uuno Turhapuro Muuttaa Maalle, developed by Pasi Haitonen and published by Amasoft in 1986, was based on the hugely popular Finnish comedy character Uuno Turhapuro.
Ruunalla koti, laavalla Esson baarille. Ruuna, Esson baarille.
Games based on regional television or film characters were common during the 1980s, but this one gained attention largely because of its difficulty. The side-scrolling levels demand precise timing, and progress rarely comes easily. For many players, the appeal lies in the determination it provokes. Each section appears manageable at first glance, yet it quickly becomes clear that progress will require patience and persistence. Even today, it stands as an example of how local culture occasionally found its way into the broader Commodore 64 catalogue. System 15000. Long before hacking became a familiar theme in films and games, System 15000 explored the idea in a surprisingly serious way. Released in 1984, the game was designed and programmed by Lee Christopherson, the pseudonym of John Wagstaff, and published by Craig Communications. Rather than presenting hacking at fast-paced action, the game focuses on understanding systems and gradually learning how they respond to different commands. You could navigate computer networks, bypass security barriers, and piece together information through experimentation. The result is slower and more methodical than most games of the period, but it captures a particular fascination that surrounded early computer networks during the 1980s. It also remains notable as one of the earliest attempts to turn computer intrusion into a playable simulation. Rock'n Wrestle. Sports and wrestling games flourished on home computers during the mid-1980s, and Rock'n Wrestle was one of the most energetic examples. Developed by Beam Software and published by Melbourne House in 1985, the game combines arcade-style wrestling with colourful presentation and lively music composed by Neil Brennan. Matches unfold quickly, with grapples, throws and strikes determining who controls the ring. Timing plays a major role, as well-placed attacks can turn the momentum of a fight in seconds. While it can be played solo, the game is most memorable as a competitive experience. Two players facing off in the same room often turned matches into dramatic contests, where every successful move was celebrated, and every mistake immediately punished. Starquake. By the mid-1980s, many developers were beginning to experiment with games that felt larger and more exploratory. Starquake, designed by Stephen Crow and published by Bubble Bobble Software in 1985, is one of those titles that quietly rewards curiosity. Set on a distant planet destabilised by catastrophic explosions, the game tasks you with restoring balance by activating a series of stabilisers hidden throughout the landscape. The design encourages exploration rather than speed. Tunnels, alien structures and strange devices gradually form a map that becomes clearer over time. What begins as an unfamiliar environment slowly turns into a recognisable world, and that sense of discovery is where the game finds its lasting appeal. Up next, we swing from One More Go arcade games into titles that start doing bigger things: tension, storytelling, systems, and the kind of atmosphere you don't expect from the early 80s. Space Taxi. Among the many inventive arcade-style games released for the Commodore 64, Space Taxi stands out because it manages to be both technically impressive and immediately memorable. Written by John F. Kutcher and published by M.U.L.E Software in 1984, the game places you in control of a futuristic taxi service, transporting passengers between floating platforms across a series of increasingly elaborate levels. The core mechanic is deceptively simple. The taxi is controlled using thrusters, and movement is governed by inertia and gravity in a way that feels remarkably precise. Landing requires careful control of velocity, balancing and timing, especially when platforms become smaller or environmental hazards start interfering with flight. What truly distinguished the game at the time was its digitised speech. Passengers call out with phrases such as "Hey taxi" or "Pad 1 please," and hearing voices coming from a home computer in 1984 felt genuinely futuristic. Beyond the novelty, the design is wonderfully disciplined. Each level introduces a new complication, shifting obstacles, strange terrain, or tricky landing zones, gradually turning what initially felt like a simple task into a demanding exercise in control and precision. Even decades later, the experience remains oddly compelling. One careful landing leads to another, and the quiet satisfaction of delivering a passenger safely is often enough to encourage one more attempt. Project Firestart. By the late 1980s, developers were beginning to experiment with storytelling in ways that went far beyond simple arcade action. Project Firestart is one of the most ambitious examples ever produced for the Commodore 64. Developed by Dynamics and published by Electronic Arts in 1989, the game was designed by Jeff Tunnell and Damon Sly, and is widely considered one of the earliest examples of what would later be called survival horror. The story begins aboard the research vessel Prometheus, orbiting Saturn's moon Titan. Communication with the station has been lost, and an agent is sent to investigate. What follows is a tense exploration of abandoned corridors, locked laboratories, and disturbing clues left behind by the missing crew. The game introduces ideas that later become staples of the genre: limited ammunition, environmental storytelling through computer terminals, and the constant sense that direct confrontation may not always be the best option. For a machine associated primarily with arcade games, Project Firestart demonstrated just how cinematic the Commodore 64 could be. Dramatic scene transitions, narrative fragments, and multiple endings combine to create an experience that feels surprisingly modern. It's one of those rare titles where the ambition of the design still feels remarkable when viewed decades later. Black Hawk. Released during the early years of the Commodore 64, Black Hawk represents a style of action game that was particularly popular in the mid-80s. Fast, demanding, and unapologetically arcade-focused. The game places you in control of a Black Hawk, navigating hostile terrain filled with enemy installations and defensive fire. Movement requires careful positioning as threats appear from multiple directions, forcing constant adjustment between attack and survival. What makes the game memorable is its intensity. The action unfolds rapidly, encouraging quick decisions and sharp reflexes. It's the kind of title that captures the spirit of early home computer gaming, straightforward in concept yet capable of producing surprisingly tense moments once the screen fills with enemy fire. Question for anyone who owned the machine back then. What was the first game you got obsessed with on your C64? Not the best one, the one you played to death, because it was yours. Fort Apocalypse. Some Commodore 64 games feel surprisingly advanced for the time in which they were released, and Fort Apocalypse is one of them. Developed by Synapse Software and released in 1982, the game places you in command of a helicopter sent deep into underground caverns to rescue scientists held captive by an alien intelligence. The mission structure gives the game a distinctive rhythm. Each descent into the cavern system feels like a carefully planned operation. Navigate narrow tunnels, avoid automated defences, locate the prisoner and escape before running out of time or fuel. The technical execution was impressive for the early life of the C64. Smooth movement, animated environments and responsive controls combined to create a sense of depth rarely seen in games of the period. Fort Apocalypse remains an excellent example of how developers quickly learned to push the Commodore 64 far beyond what many people initially expected from an 8-bit machine. Aztec Challenge. Released by Cosme in 1983 and created by programmer Paul Norman, Aztec Challenge is remembered for its distinctive sequence of varied challenges rather than a single continuous gameplay style. Each stage presents a completely different scenario. 1 minute you are sprinting towards a temple while dodging incoming spears. The next involves navigating deadly corridors, swimming through underwater hazards or racing through shifting landscapes. This variety was one of the game's defining strengths. Rather than repeating the same mechanic across dozens of levels, Aztec Challenge constantly introduced new situations that required different timing and reactions. The presentation also deserves recognition. The opening run towards the temple, with enemies launching spears from the sides of the screen, became one of the most recognisable sequences in early Commodore 64 gaming. For many of us, it was also the moments we realised the game would not be forgiving. That's the warm-up out of the way. From here on, the list starts hitting games that people still argue about today. And yes, some of them are absolute friendship destroyers in 2-player. Wizard. Few games from the early Commodore 64 catalogue demonstrate the creativity of individual developers quite like Wizard. Created by Stephen F. Day and published by Commodore in 1984, the game combines action, exploration, and puzzle solving within a dungeon environment filled with monsters and magical hazards. You guide your wizard through a dangerous labyrinth while collecting treasure and surviving increasingly difficult encounters. Yet the game's appeal lies in the way it layers different challenges together. Combat, navigation and strategy all play a role in surviving each expedition. Wizard belongs to a class of early computer games where imagination fills in the details. The environments may be minimal by modern standards, but for many of us discovering the Commodore 64 during its early years, experiences like this help define what home computer gaming could be. Rambo: First Blood Part 2. During the mid-1980s, film tie-in games appeared everywhere, but only a handful managed to capture the spirit of their source material. Rambo: First Blood Part 2, released on the Commodore 64 in 1986, was published by Ocean Software. The game loosely follows the plot of the 1985 film, sending Rambo into the Vietnamese jungle to locate and rescue American prisoners of war. The action unfolds across a series of missions involving jungle infiltration, combat with enemy forces, and a dramatic helicopter escape. Technically, the game was impressive for its time. The Commodore 64 version featured music composed by Martin Galway, one of the most celebrated composers associated with the system, incorporating melodies from the film's score. What made the game memorable was the way it blended action with atmosphere. Dense jungle terrain, guard towers and enemy patrols created the sense of moving through hostile territory rather than simply clearing waves of enemies. For me, as a kid at the time, it felt like stepping directly into the world of one of cinema's biggest action heroes. The Train: Escape to Normandy. Strategy games on the Commodore 64 often proved that thoughtful design could create tension just as effectively as fast reflexes. Released in 1988 by Accolade, The Train: Escape to Normandy was designed by Artec Digital Entertainment and places you in command of a French resistance operation attempting to transport stolen artwork across occupied territory. The objective was simple in theory: guide a train through Nazi-controlled rail networks while avoiding detection and sabotage. In practice, the challenge becomes a fascinating exercise in planning and anticipation. Track switches must be managed carefully, enemy patrols monitored, and timing becomes critical. What makes the game stand out is its unique perspective. Instead of fighting on the battlefield, you are managing a covert operation unfolding between the lines. If you prefer games that reward planning more than reflexes, you're about to get fed. If you prefer reflexes, don't worry. The list absolutely comes back swinging. International Soccer. Before football simulations became increasingly complex, international soccer captured the excitement of the sport with remarkable efficiency. Created by Andrew Spencer and released by Commodore in 1983, the game was one of the earliest football titles available for the Commodore 64. At a glance, the presentation appears simple. 2 teams, a scrolling pitch, and straightforward controls. Yet the design contains surprising depth. Passing, shooting and positioning all rely heavily on timing, and matches often swing dramatically depending on how you read the movement of the ball. For many early C64 owners, this was the game that introduced competitive sports gaming at home. Matches between friends could quickly become intense, with every goal celebrated and every missed opportunity immediately replayed in conversation. Well, that's how it was for me and my brother. It laid the groundwork for the football games that followed, proving that the sport translated beautifully to home computers. Grand Prix Circuit. When Microprose released Grand Prix Circuit in 1988, they brought a level of realism that few racing games had attempted before. The company, founded by Sid Meier and Bill Steely, had already built a reputation for sophisticated simulations, and this Formula One title followed the same philosophy. The game recreates several famous circuits from the late 1980s Formula One calendar, including Monaco, Silverstone and Zandvoort, each with distinctive layouts that require different approaches to driving. Handling plays a central role. Cars must be balanced through corners, braking points must be learned, and maintaining control through high-speed sections becomes the key to competitive lap times. While many racing games focus purely on speed, Grand Prix Circuit emphasise the experience of managing a real racing machine. For those of us willing to learn its rhythms, it offered one of the most convincing motorsport simulations available on the Commodore 64. But then, there was also this classic. Pitstop II. Few racing games of the 1980s delivered such an immediate sense of competition as Pitstop II. Developed and published by Epix in 1984, the game built upon the original Pitstop by introducing a feature that quickly became legendary: true split-screen multiplayer. Instead of taking turns, 2 of you could race simultaneously on the same machine, with the screen divided horizontally. One race view on the top half, the other on the bottom. The result was electric. Every overtake, every mistake, and every risky pit stop happened in real time. The pit sequence itself became one of the game's most memorable features. Cars would pull into the pit lane, and the crew would rush out to replace tyres and refuel, while the race clock continued to tick. Moments like these gave the game a sense of authenticity that few racing titles had attempted at the time. Even today, Pitstop II remains one of the most celebrated multiplayer racing experiences of the Commodore 64 era. Real talk now, the C64 was a social machine. Half of those weren't just games, they were events. Were you a play nice and take turns household, or a winner stays on household? Elite. Some games define an entire genre. Elite is one of them. Originally created by David Braben and Ian Bell, Elite introduced us to a vast open universe of trading, exploration and combat. The Commodore 64 version arrived in 1985, bringing the experience to one of the most popular home computers of the decade. Instead of presenting a fixed set of levels, the game offers a living galaxy filled with hundreds of star systems. We begin with a modest spacecraft and a small amount of credits, gradually building our reputation through trade, bounty hunting or exploration. One of the most memorable aspects of Elite is its docking system. Approaching the rotating entrance of a space station and aligning the ship correctly became a rite of passage for new players. Elite demonstrated that home computers could deliver expansive worlds long before the term open world became common in game design. It remains one of the most influential games ever produced for the Commodore 64. Neuromancer. Few games captured the emerging fascination with cyberpunk culture as effectively as Neuromancer. Released in 1988 by Interplay, the game was based on the influential science fiction novel by William Gibson, a book widely credited with defining the cyberpunk genre. Set in a dark, futuristic world of hackers, corporations and artificial intelligence, the game combines adventure elements with role-playing mechanics. We'd navigate a network of digital systems known as cyberspace, attempting to infiltrate secure networks while upgrading our equipment and skills. What made Neuromancer particularly immersive was the scale of its concept. The game tried to recreate the feel of Gibson's novel, a complex world of information networks and shadowy digital economies. For many Commodore 64 owners, it was their first encounter with a game that treated computers themselves as part of the story. This is where the list gets slightly dangerous. The cult favourites start appearing. If you're watching and thinking, I'd never even heard of that one, good, that's the point. These are the ones that surprise people. Creatures. Released by Thalamus in 1990, Creatures arrived surprisingly late in the Commodore 64's commercial lifespan. At a time when many believed the machine had already reached its limits, the game demonstrated just how much life remained in the hardware. Developed by Apex Computer Productions, Creatures follows the adventures of Clyde Radcliffe, a cheerful hero navigating strange environments filled with mechanical traps and bizarre enemies. The game quickly became famous for its energetic presentation. Smooth animation, colourful environments and the distinctive music of Steve Rowlands combined to create a lively experience that stood out among platform games of the period. It was also proof that talented developers were still finding new ways to push the Commodore 64 well into the 1990s. Bubble Bobble. Arcade conversions were a major part of the Commodore 64 library, and Bubble Bobble ranks amongst the most successful. Originally developed by Taito for arcades and released on the C64 in 1987 by Firebird, the game centres on two dragon characters who trap enemies inside bubbles before popping them. The idea is instantly understandable, but the design grows increasingly inventive as the levels progress. Platforms become more complex, enemies behave in unpredictable ways, and cooperative play introduces new strategies. One of the reasons Bubble Bobble endured so well is its balance between accessibility and challenge. The early stages invite experimentation, while later levels demand careful planning and coordination. For many of us, it became one of the most addictive cooperative games available on the Commodore 64. Choplifter. Originally created by Dan Golin and released by Broderbund, Choplifter was one of the earliest helicopter action games to achieve widespread success. We'd pilot a rescue helicopter through enemy territory, locate prisoners, and transport them back to safety. The challenge comes from balancing two priorities: protecting the helicopter from hostile fire while ensuring that rescued soldiers reach the aircraft safely. Enemy tanks, aircraft, and ground troops constantly threaten the mission, forcing careful manoeuvring through hostile skies. Choplifter became influential, not just because of its gameplay, but because it helped demonstrate how home computers could recreate the tension of arcade-style action within a larger mission structure. Top 30. From here on, you're in history lesson territory. The games that got copied, studied, cloned, and quietly influenced everything that came later. Defender of the Crown. When Defender of the Crown appeared on the Commodore 64 in 1987, it immediately stood apart from most games of the era. Developed and published by CinemaWare, the title attempted something unusual for the time, blending multiple gameplay styles within a single historical narrative. Set in medieval England during the struggle between Saxons and Normans, the game combined strategy, jousting tournaments, castle sieges, and political manoeuvring as we'd attempt to unite the country under our own banner. What made it memorable was its presentation. CinemaWare deliberately designed the game to resemble a historical film, complete with detailed artwork and dramatic sequences that emphasised the story unfolding across England. At a time when many games relied purely on arcade mechanics, Defender of the Crown demonstrated that home computers could deliver something closer to an interactive epic. M.U.L.E. Few games from the early Commodore 64 era are remembered as fondly as M.U.L.E. Released by Electronic Arts in 1983 and designed by the legendary Dan Bunton. The game placed us on the distant planet Uridium, where colonists compete to build a thriving settlement by managing resources such as food, energy, and minerals. At its heart, M.U.L.E. is an economic strategy game, but its genius lies in how accessible the system feels. Resource shortages, fluctuating prices, and unpredictable events constantly reshape the balance of the colony. More importantly, the game thrives in multiplayer. Negotiation, alliances, and friendly sabotage quickly became part of the experience. M.U.L.E. proved that strategy games could be social, competitive, and deeply engaging. A rare combination that still feels remarkable today. Quick debate. What's the best group game on the Commodore 64? The one that turns into shouting, bargaining, and blaming the joystick when it goes wrong. Or maybe when you don't even know how to fly out of a hangar. Raid over Moscow. Released by Access Software in 1984, Raid over Moscow became one of the most controversial games of its time. The game placed us in command of a series of missions designed to stop a nuclear strike against North America. Each stage presents a different challenge, from intercepting enemy missiles to infiltrating Soviet facilities. The political backdrop of the Cold War made the premise unusually provocative, particularly in parts of Europe where the game sparked heated public debate. Beyond the controversy, however, Raid over Moscow is remembered for its varied gameplay. Each mission introduces new mechanics and escalating stakes, creating a sense that we were participating in a larger conflict. It was a striking example of how games in the 1980s occasionally reflected the anxieties of our real world. Gauntlet. Originally an arcade hit developed by Atari Games, Gauntlet arrived on the Commodore 64 in 1986, bringing one of the most recognisable dungeon crawling experiences of the decade to home computers. You choose from 4 characters: warrior, wizard, elf, or Valkyrie, and descend into labyrinthine dungeons filled with monsters, traps, and treasure. What set Gauntlet apart was its constant pressure. Enemy generators continuously producing new foes, forcing you to keep moving rather than cautiously clearing each room. The game also became famous for its voice samples in the arcade version, particularly the warning, "Wizard needs food badly." On the Commodore 64, the core gameplay remained intact. Fast-paced dungeon exploration where cooperation and quick decision-making were essential to survival. If you like games that punish panic and reward control, the next stretch is loaded with them, the kind where your hands learn the timing before your brain does. IK Plus. When International Karate Plus, better known simply as IK Plus, arrived in 1987, it quickly became one of the most respected fighting games on the Commodore 64. Created by Archer McLean and published by System 3, the game expanded on the earlier International Karate by introducing a third fighter. This simple change transformed the entire experience. Instead of one-on-one combat, matches now involve 3 competitors battling simultaneously for points. Fast controls, fluid animation and cleverly designed backgrounds made the game immediately appealing. Between rounds, humorous bonus stages added light-hearted interludes, such as deflecting bouncing balls. IK Plus demonstrated that fighting games could combine technical skill with a sense of playfulness, a balance that made it enormously popular among Commodore 64 owners. Jet Set Willy. Few games capture the spirit of early British home computer development quite like Jet Set Willy. Originally developed by Manic Miner creator Matthew Smith and released in 1984 courtesy of the Shahid Ahmad port, the game follows the misadventures of Willy, a wealthy adventurer attempting to clean up his mansion after an extravagant party. The objective is to collect objects scattered throughout a vast network of rooms before returning to bed. Yet the difficulty quickly becomes apparent. Each room introduces new hazards, requiring careful timing and precision. Jet Set Willy became legendary not only for its challenge but also for the scale of its world. Dozens of interconnected rooms created the feeling of exploring an enormous, eccentric mansion filled with surprises. For many of us, it remains one of the defining platform adventures of the 1980s. This is also where you feel that very specific British home computer personality. Weird humour, unfair traps, stubborn level design, and somehow it still keeps you coming back. Turrican. By the time Turrican arrived on the Commodore 64 in 1990, developers had become extraordinarily skilled at pushing the machine's capabilities. The game was created by Manfred Trenz and published by Rainbow Arts, delivering a side-scrolling action experience filled with expansive levels and intense combat. You had to guide a heavily armed hero through alien landscapes, battling mechanical enemies while collecting upgrades that dramatically expand the character's abilities. What set Turrican apart was its scale. Levels stretched far beyond the boundaries typically expected from platform shooters, encouraging exploration as much as combat. Combined with its energetic soundtrack, the game quickly established itself as one of the most technically impressive titles on the system. The Sentinel. Few games are as unusual or as thought-provoking as The Sentinel. Designed by Jeff Crammond and released in 1986, the game placed you in a surreal landscape composed of geometric terrain and towering figures. The objective is to absorb energy from the environment and eventually confront the Sentinel itself. Rather than relying on reflexes, the game revolves around observation and strategy. You must carefully position yourself, using trees within the landscape to gain a tactical advantage. The result is a strangely hypnotic experience that feels closer to a puzzle than a traditional action game. Even decades later, the Sentinel remains one of the most distinctive ideas ever implemented on the Commodore 64. Ace of Aces. Flight simulations were a natural fit for home computers, and Ace of Aces, released by Accolade in 1986, offered one of the most imaginative approaches to the genre. Rather than presenting a single cockpit view, the game allowed you to switch between several perspectives within the aircraft: pilot view, bombardier position, and rear gunner station. Each perspective plays a specific role in the mission, and success depends on switching between them at the right moment. This multi-view design created a sense of managing an entire aircraft rather than simply flying it. For any of us fascinated by aviation history and World War II aircraft, Ace of Aces delivered a uniquely immersive experience on the Commodore 64. Zach McKracken and the Alien Mindbenders. Adventure games flourished on home computers during the late 1980s, and Zach McKracken and the Alien Mindbenders stands amongst the most memorable. Developed by Lucasfilm Games and released in 1988, the game uses the Scum engine, the same system that powered many of the company's classic adventures. We follow the eccentric journalist Zack as he uncovers a bizarre alien conspiracy involving mind control and mysterious artifacts scattered across the world. What distinguishes the game is its humour and creativity. Locations range from San Francisco to ancient ruins, and puzzles often require inventive solutions that reward curiosity. Zack McKracken helped establish Lucasfilm Games as one of the leading developers of adventure games, and it remains a beloved part of the Commodore 64 library. Now, we're entering the part of the list where even people who didn't own a C64 still recognise the music, the catchphrases, or the screenshots. And one of these has a line you can hear in your head even right now.
Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Impossible Mission. When Impossible Mission arrived on the Commodore 64 in 1984, it immediately became one of the system's most recognisable titles. Developed and published by Epix, the game was created by programmer Dennis Caswell and quickly gained attention for both its presentation and its design. The premise is simple but effective. A secret agent infiltrates the underground complex of the villain Professor Elvin Atombender, searching for fragments of a password that will prevent a catastrophic attack. The game's structure revolves around exploring a network of rooms, avoiding robotic guards and carefully searching furniture for clues. Every action consumes time, creating a constant tension between caution and urgency. What truly captured our attention in 1984 was the opening voice sample. Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever. Hearing spoken dialogue on a home computer felt extraordinary at the time, and the phrase quickly became one of the most famous lines in Commodore 64 history. Impossible Mission remains a brilliant example of how clever design can turn a simple concept into a lasting classic. Dino Eggs. Released in 1983 by Microfun and designed by David Schroeder, Dino Eggs introduced a wonderfully unusual premise. We'd control a time traveller named Time Master Tim, sent back to the prehistoric era with a single objective: rescue dinosaur eggs before they hatch. The task might sound straightforward, but the environment quickly proves dangerous. Tim must collect eggs while avoiding falling boulders, hostile creatures, and the ever-present threat of Dino Mum, whose enormous foot appears without warning to crush anything beneath it. One of the most distinctive mechanics involves keeping a fire burning. The torch is the only defense against many enemies, but it slowly fades unless it's carefully maintained. Dino Eggs combines platforming, strategy, and constant awareness of the environment. The result is a game that feels deceptively simple at first glance, but reveals surprising depth with each attempt. Archon. The Light and the Dark. In 1983, Electronic Arts released a game that blended strategy and action in a way few players had seen before. Designed by John Freeman and Anne Westfall, Archon, The Light and the Dark takes place on a mystical chessboard where opposing forces battle for control of magical squares. Each piece on the board represents a different creature: knights, dragons, phoenixes and wizards. But unlike traditional chess, encounters are resolved through direct combat. When two pieces meet, the game switches to an arena, where you must defeat the opponent using each creature's unique abilities. The shifting balance between strategic planning and real-time combat gives Archon a distinctive rhythm. Victory depends not only on positioning, but also how well you handle each confrontation. It remains one of the most inventive strategy games produced for the Commodore 64. By the way, are you here for the arcade hitters, the adventures, or the deep, weird stuff? Drop your favourite genre in the comments, because the last stretch hits all three. Robin of the Wood. Released by Odin Computer Graphics in 1985, Robin of the Wood offered a thoughtful take on the legend of Robin Hood. We need to explore Sherwood Forest while searching for magical artifacts required to defeat the Sheriff of Nottingham. Along the way, hostile creatures and supernatural forces attempt to prevent progress. The forest feels mysterious and unpredictable, with hidden locations gradually revealing themselves as you become more familiar with the landscape. The soundtrack, composed by Fred Gray, adds a haunting quality to the experience, and even though it loops, it does reinforce the atmosphere of wandering through a mythical woodland. Robin of the Wood stands out as one of the more distinctive adventure experiences available on the Commodore 64. Barry McGuigan Boxing. Sports games often focused on speed or spectacle, but Barry McGuigan Boxing, released by Activision in 1985, approached the sport with surprising authenticity. Named after the famous Irish featherweight champion, the game allows you to guide a boxer through a career, facing increasingly skilled opponents. Timing and stamina management are central to gameplay. Attacks must be carefully chosen, and reckless aggression quickly leads to exhaustion. The match presentation captures the rhythm of boxing, moments of cautious movement punctuated by bursts of rapid punches. For many of us, it became one of the most convincing sporting experiences available on the Commodore 64. From here, the list stops being great games and starts being household names, the ones that got traded on tapes, talked about in school, and argued about in magazines. Green Beret. Arcade conversions were a major part of the Commodore 64 library, and Green Beret, released by Imagine Software in 1986, brought the action of Konami's arcade hit to home computers. The game placed us in control of an elite soldier fighting through enemy bases to rescue prisoners of war. Armed with a combat knife and an assortment of captured weapons, the protagonist battles waves of enemies across a series of horizontally scrolling stages. What made Green Beret memorable was its relentless pace. Enemies approach from all directions, forcing constant movement and quick reactions. The result is a game that captures the intensity of arcade action while remaining perfectly suited to the Commodore 64. Commodore. Few games define the run-and-gun genre as clearly as Commodore. Originally developed by Capcom for arcades and released on the Commodore 64 in 1985, the home conversion was created by Elite Systems, with music composed by the legendary Rob Hubbard. We'd guide a lone soldier through enemy territory, battling waves of troops while navigating bridges, bunkers, and military installations. The gameplay is straightforward but intensely satisfying. Grenades and machine gun fire create constant opportunities for dramatic escapes and narrow victories. Rob Hubbard's soundtrack became almost as famous as the game itself, demonstrating the extraordinary music capabilities of the Commodore 64's SID sound chip. Commodore remains one of the most iconic action games ever released for the system. Forbidden Forest. Few early Commodore 64 games created such a distinctive atmosphere as Forbidden Forest. Developed by Paul Norman and released by Cosme in 1983, the game placed us in a dark woodland where our archer confronted giant spiders, dragons, and other monstrous creatures. Each encounter unfolds on a side-scrolling screen. We'd need to carefully aim arrows while avoiding attacks from powerful enemies. What made the game memorable was its mood. Minimalist graphics, eerie sound design, and dramatic music created a sense of tension rarely seen in early home computer games. Forbidden Forest demonstrated that even simple mechanics could produce a memorable experience when combined with strong atmosphere and clever presentation. Dander, Pilot of the Future. Based on the classic British comic hero, Dan Durr, pilot of the future, hit the Commodore 64 in 1986. Developed by Gang of Five and released by Virgin Games, it was actually my mum who bought me this one when I was sick with chickenpox. I always remind her of this, as it was a genius choice of game and kept me going for those 2 weeks in isolation as a young kid. The story begins with Dan's longtime enemy, the Mekon, threatening Earth by sending a massive asteroid on a collision course with the planet. Dan travels to the asteroid to stop the plan, only to find that his allies have been captured and the base is already heavily defended. The Commodore 64 version is quite different from the other computer releases. Instead of focusing on shooting or platforming, it plays more like an arcade adventure, where exploration and problem solving are just as important as action. We'd need to search the asteroid's surface and underground complex, locating items, and sabotaging the Mekon's system before time runs out. Encounters with the Mekon's Treen Guards led to hand-to-hand boxing fights, giving the game an unusual rhythm that mixes exploration with bursts of combat. With its mixture of puzzle solving, action and science fiction storytelling, Dan Durr stands as one of the more distinctive licensed games produced for the Commodore 64. Ghostbusters. Few film adaptations achieve the popularity of Ghostbusters. Released by Activision in 1984 and designed by David Crane. Rather than recreating scenes directly from the movie, the game allowed you to manage your own ghost hunting franchise. Who can forget the bouncing ball intro and the Ghostbusters sample? The whole experience for many of us began with purchasing equipment, choosing vehicles, and preparing for paranormal activity across the city. I'd even spent time as a kid just messing around with a forklift truck. Once ghosts appear, you drive to haunted locations and attempt to capture them using the famous proton packs. The blend of business management and arcade action proved remarkably engaging, and as mentioned, the game also featured a memorable music rendition of the film's theme. Ghostbusters became one of the biggest hits on the Commodore 64, and remains one of the most successful movie tie-in games of the era. If your favourite isn't in here, I want to know what you'd swap, and what you'd never remove, even at gunpoint. Kung Fu Master. By the mid-80s, arcade action games were becoming a central part of the Commodore 64 library, and Kung Fu Master was one of the titles that helped define the genre. Originally developed by IREM for arcades and later adapted for home computers, the Commodore 64 version arrived in 1985 through US Gold. A lone fighter must climb the 5 floors of a temple to rescue his kidnapped girlfriend. Each level introduces new enemies and attack patterns, gradually increasing the difficulty as the hero fights his way upward. What made the game memorable was its rhythm. Movement, strikes and jumps combine into a flowing sequence where timing is everything. You learn to anticipate attacks, manage spacing and react quickly to enemies approaching from both directions. Kung Fu Master established a template that countless side-scrolling action games would later follow, proving that the Commodore 64 could deliver an arcade experience that felt fast, immediate and satisfying. The Last Ninja. Few Commodore 64 games achieve the cultural impact of The Last Ninja. Released by System 3 in 1987, the game was developed by John Twiddy and Hugh Riley, with music composed by Ben Daglish and Anthony Lees. Set in feudal Japan, the story follows the final survivor of the Armakuni ninja clan as he attempts to defeat his rival, the warlord Kunitoki. The game's distinctive isometric perspective immediately set it apart from most action titles of the era. Instead of simple horizontal movements, we'd explore carefully designed environments filled with traps, puzzles, and hidden pathways. Each screen feels deliberate, almost like a small puzzle. crossing a bridge, navigating stepping stones, or engaging in sword combat requires careful positioning and patience. Combined with its atmospheric soundtrack and striking visual style, The Last Ninja became one of the most celebrated titles ever released for the Commodore 64. Uridium. When discussing technical excellence on the Commodore 64, Uridium is almost always part of the conversation. Released by Hewson Consultants in 1986 and developed by Graftgold, the game was designed by Andrew Braybrook with music composed by Steve Turner. Uridium is a side-scrolling shooter set along the surfaces of enormous enemy spacecraft. We'd pilot a fighter craft tasked with destroying defences and ultimately landing on the vessel once its systems have been disabled. What impressed many at the time was the speed and smoothness of the scrolling. The game moves with extraordinary fluidity, giving the impression of racing across the hull of a massive machine, while turrets and obstacles rush towards the screen. Despite its technical achievements, Uridium remains wonderfully focused in design. Each level is a concentrated test of reflexes, positioning, and quick decision making. It is widely regarded as one of the finest shooters ever produced for the Commodore 64. BC's Quest for Tyres. Among the many quirky games of the 1980s, BC's Quest for Tyres stands out for its humour and originality. Released in 1984 by Sierra Online, the game was based on the popular comic strip BC by Johnny Hart. We guided a prehistoric hero riding a stone wheel across a series of obstacle-filled landscapes. The objective is simply to reach the end of each stage while avoiding hazards such as rocks, holes, turtle rivers, and stalactites. What makes the game memorable is its sense of movement. The wheel rolls continuously forward, turning each level into a sequence of carefully timed jumps and manoeuvres. It is a simple concept executed with great clarity. A reminder that sometimes a single clever mechanic is all a game needs to become memorable. Bruce Lee. Few games captured the personality of their subject as effectively as Bruce Lee. Released on the Commodore 64 in 1984 by Datasoft. We guided the legendary martial artist through a fortress filled with traps and enemies while searching for lanterns that unlock the exit. The game's mechanics revolve around Bruce Lee's distinctive fighting style. Flying kicks, jumps and precise timing allowed us to overcome both environmental hazards and the fortress guards. Two recurring adversaries, the Green Yamo and the Ninja, appear throughout the game, creating a playful rivalry that many of us still remember. Bruce Lee succeeds because it balances action and some humour when outsmarting the enemies perfectly, delivering an experience that feels lively without becoming overwhelming. It remains one of the most beloved action games on the Commodore 64. If you're already gearing up to disagree, good. Just do it in the comments like a responsible adult. Archon. Some arcade conversions became legendary simply because they captured the original experience so effectively. Archon is one of those games. Originally created by Taito, the Commodore 64 version arrived in 1987 through Imagine Software, bringing the addictive block-breaking gameplay to our Commodore 64. You'd control a sort of structure called a vase at the bottom of the screen, deflecting a ball towards rows of blocks. As levels progress, power-ups introduce new abilities such as multi-ball, laser cannons and extended sizes. The brilliance of Archon lies in its balance. Every stage introduces just enough variation to remain interesting without overwhelming the core mechanic. It's a game that invites quick sessions but easily stretches into long ones as each cleared screen naturally leads to another attempt. It wasn't easy, but I loved it. I had the paddles as a kid and found it much easier to control with, but if you've got a joystick or are using keys, it's still pretty responsive. That's the magic of Arkanoid. Straightforward to understand, tough to master, and endlessly replayable. The Commodore 64 version delivered that formula brilliantly in 1987, and once you got into it, it was very hard to walk away from. Even now, it still feels like one of the finest pick-up-and-play arcade conversions on the C64. Wizball. Released by Archon in 1987 and developed by Sentinel Software, Wizball remains one of the most unusual and inventive shooters on the Commodore 64. Designed by John Herr and Chris Yates, the game begins in a strange monochrome world where colour has been drained from the landscape. You control a wizard, transformed into a rotating green ball, tasked with restoring colour by collecting magical droplets released by enemies. Rather than simply destroying everything on screen, your success depends on carefully gathering these droplets and delivering them back to a cauldron, gradually bringing the environment back to life. As the game progresses, a companion called Catalyte joins the journey, allowing cooperative play where one player focuses on combat while the other collects colour. Combined with Martin Galway's memorable soundtrack, Wizball stands as one of the most creative and distinctive titles ever produced for the Commodore 64. Paradroid. Released in 1985 by Hewson Consultants, Paradroid quickly established itself as one of the most original and technically impressive games on the Commodore 64. It might not look much at first glance, but trust me, play this for a few minutes and you'll understand just why it's in my top 3. Designed by Andrew Braybrook, the game takes place aboard a massive spacecraft overrun by hostile robots. Instead of simply roaming around destroying enemies, you control a small service droid capable of transferring its consciousness into other machines. This allows you to take control of stronger robots and use their abilities against remaining enemies. Superb idea for a game. The mechanic transforms combat into a strategic decision. Should a powerful robot be destroyed, or is it worth attempting a risky takeover? This unusual design gives Paradroid a depth rarely seen in action games of the period. Even decades later, it remains one of the most imaginative concepts ever implemented on the Commodore 64, and I still love to pick this up and give it a whirl from now and then. Even though my reflexes aren't quite what they were back in 1985. Two left. One is pure imagination turned into a game. The other feels like it's trying to give you an entire life to live inside the C64. Master of Magic. I love this game. It was released by MAD, Mastertronic Added Dimension, in 1985, and the Master of Magic is one of those budget-era Commodore 64 games that managed to feel far bigger and more atmospheric than its price tag suggested. Programmed by Richard Darling, with graphics by James Wilson and music by Rob Hubbard, it stands out as a distinctive fantasy adventure with strong presentation and a real sense of mystery. Rather than controlling a little blob through simple arcade-style chambers, you play an unnamed adventurer who is dragged into a strange magical world by Thelric, the titular Master of Magic. From there, the game unfolds into a perilous journey across a hostile fantasy realm as you battle orcs, skeletons, bats and hellhounds in a desperate search for the Amulet of Immortality, exploring dangerous locations and making crucial decisions as the adventure draws you ever deeper in. I absolutely loved Master of Magic as a kid. It wasn't just about deciding when to fight and when to avoid the enemies, but also knowing which weapons worked against which creatures if you did choose to stand your ground. You had to think quickly, because danger was never far away. The first time I ran into Dracula without the right weapon is something I've never forgotten. Death came swiftly. As a kid, there was this real feeling of tension and discovery as I'd learn how the world works, manage threats, and gradually make sense of a game that feels mysterious by design. Even the instructions warn that some of its messages could be misleading, which adds to the sense that this is a magical world even if the graphics were a bit rudimentary. It was all about using your imagination. A huge part of that lasting appeal comes from Rob Hubbard's superb soundtrack, which gives the game an identity far beyond its simple visuals. On the Commodore 64 in particular, the music helps transform the experience into something eerie, adventurous and strangely absorbing. It remains one of the finest examples of how Rob Hubbard's music could elevate a game, giving it an atmosphere and identity that stayed with you long after the Minotaur had fallen and the amulets had been returned to Thelric. The Master of Magic remains a fine example of how imaginative design, strong music and a compelling fantasy setting could make a mid-80s budget title feel genuinely special. It obviously doesn't have the scale of later role-playing adventures, but it did capture that unmistakable Commodore 64 magic. A game that draws you in with mystery, challenges you with danger and leaves a much bigger impression than you might expect. Sid Meier's Pirates. When Pirates arrived on the Commodore 64 in 1987, it felt like someone had suddenly handed me the keys to the entire Caribbean. Developed by Microprose and designed by Sid Meier, the game dropped us into the 17th century and basically said, off you go then. You could become a feared pirate, a respectable privateer, a treasure hunter, or, more realistically, a man who started with big ambitions and somehow ended up being chased across the sea by half the known world. You command your own ship, build up a crew and sail between colonial ports, taking on rival captains, hunting treasure, and trying to stay on the right side of whichever European power happens to be useful that week. One minute you are swaggering into town like the terror of the Spanish Main, and the next you are desperately trying to explain why your crew is mutinous, your ship is falling apart, and your grand plan has somehow turned into a very expensive disaster. That is what made Pirates so special. It didn't force you down a narrow path or treat you like a passenger. It gave you a map to the world, handed you a ship, and let you create your own adventure within it. You could chase fame, fortune, romance or revenge, and usually make a complete mess of at least one of them. What makes the game so memorable is the sheer variety packed into it. Naval battles, sword fights, treasure maps, promotions, trading and exploration all come together in a way that somehow feels natural rather than overstuffed. It should feel overambitious, but instead it felt effortlessly entertaining. The freedom was rare in 1987, and on the Commodore 64 it made Sid Meier's Pirates feel bold, unpredictable and years ahead of its time. It is not just one of the system's most influential games, but one of those titles that still makes you stop and admire just how much could be achieved when imagination and design came together properly. It goes to prove that creativity and careful design can leave a lasting impression, even decades after the original hardware first appeared. This is why it goes down as my #1 Commodore 64 game in the list of essential games you definitely have to play. And that's my 50. Not the only 50, not the official 50, just 50 games that still feel essential even now. Now I want yours. What's your essential Commodore 64 game? And what's the one I've somehow left out that deserves to be on every list like this? If you enjoy this, I might do a follow-up with 50 underrated C64 games, the ones that don't always make the list but absolutely deserve the attention. Like, subscribe, and if you want manuals, screenshots and all the extras, everything's on the website. I've been the Cheeky Commodore Gamer. Thanks for watching, guys, and hopefully, I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, bye for now.
Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.